Started. So, hey, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, as a board member with KCADP, it is so awesome to see this kind of turnout and this kind of interest in this issue. In my 4+ years as a board member, I don't think we've had attendance or enthusiasm this good in quite a while. I see Steve nodding his head. So again, just thank you everybody for coming out, regardless of if you're somebody who's engaged with us before or you're brand new to this. And what we are going to do here in this room, and which will be repeated again for the next crop of people coming in, is I am going to do my best to give you kind of a historical and a legal overview of the Kansas death penalty, all right? Because, our mission as an organization is to repeal in this state, right? This is our focus. All right, here in our own backyard. And so I want to focus on us specifically as much as possible when we're talking about this issue. So a little bit of background about me. My name is Kelson Bohnet. I began my career as a public defender in the Colorado public defender system. After about 5 years, I went to the Virginia public defender system where I started doing death penalty trial work. And I am now in the capital trial unit here in the Kansas public defender system. So I'm kind of just ticking off all the states and their PD systems. But I've now spent over half my career just doing death penalty cases, okay? And so, there are a couple people in this room who actually are smarter than me and know more about this than me. I'm gonna try not to embarrass myself, but hopefully for those of you that are new to this issue, who are trying to engage with your friends, your neighbors, your fellow parishioners at church, all right, meeting with legislators, writing to legislators, doing these calls to action. These are the kind of things that we want to be able to give you and put in your mind so that we know about this issue, we know how it affects Kansans, and we're more informed going into those conversations, okay? So the first place that I want to start is a question you would think is very obvious. Does Kansas have the death penalty? Okay. Now, we laugh at this question, all right? Hopefully everybody knows the answer is yes. But every year, without fail, when we go and talk to new House members and new senators of either party, regardless of their career and professional background, without fail, at least one or two, every year, I didn't know Kansas had the death penalty. Okay, so I am from the state of Alabama, and as we say down in those parts, bless their hearts. All right. So, anyways, I did not say the great state of Alabama. Everybody clocked that. All right. So, what I want to do is I want to give a little bit of historical overview with the death penalty. All right. So we're going to start in the past and kind of how this has run its course through our state. All right, so 1861, Kansas becomes a state, and it was then or very shortly thereafter that the death penalty goes into effect. All right. Now, within about 9 years, less than a decade, basically the state goes into this period called de facto abolition, where the death penalty remained on the books, but it was not actually being pursued by any prosecutors, judges, courts, anything like that, all right? What we know about that era, or as best we know about that era, because records and the justice system were a little bit crazy back then, were there were about 9 men in Kansas who were executed at that 9-year period. Now, 1907, the state takes the official step and we get the death penalty off the books. Okay, so it's not even kind of an ominous thing that's hanging on in our code. It is completely gone. But then, and I'm not a historian, so I can't say what prompted this, 1935 rolls around and the state feels like it needs to get back in the killing business. All right, so they put the seesaw happens again and the death penalty is back on. All right, and that lasts until 1972, when the United States Supreme Court and our friends on that beautiful court announce that the death penalty in America is so broken and so arbitrary. There's no rhyme or reason to who's getting it. There are huge fairness problems. There are huge problems with the legal frameworks in all these death penalty states at the time. It's a case called Furman, and the United States Supreme Court says no more. We're not saying never no more, but until y'all get your act together and give us some actual schemes that might veer somewhere toward fairness, we're done. And so all the way until 1976, 4 years, nobody in this country is legally being sentenced to death and nobody is being executed. However, a bunch of states were really, really committed to killing people. And so what those states did is their legislators got together and, in their just really committed spirit, said, okay, we hear you. We're going to make some death penalty schemes and laws that comport to what you, United States Supreme Court, have said is necessary for this to continue and keep going. And so in 1976, the Supreme Court gets about 4 or 5 of these on their door: Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, some others. And they, at that point, begin to bless some of them and say, okay, you have given us frameworks that satisfy the concerns we expressed 4 years ago. We see guarantees of process. We see safety guards and off-ramps here, so we're going to allow it. All right? And some of these states that had those schemes at that time, you have pretty substantially similar ones to today. Some of them, God bless North Carolina, they tried to take the Supreme Court a statutory scheme that was like, well, we'll just make the death penalty mandatory for every murder. And they were told that they had to go back to the drawing board. That is kind of an interesting period, but we refer to this after 1976 as the modern era of the death penalty. Okay, now, notice that when I'm talking about 1976 and all these states trotting up their new death penalty laws, Kansas never left my lips, okay? Fun fact about Kansas, 1994, we are the last state in this country that still has the death penalty to adopt it in the modern era, okay? The very, very last one. Everyone else has had that longer in this era. Okay, so 1994 is when it went back on the books. And when we're talking about, being a small state in general, but then having it only now just this 30th anniversary, we've had it, kind of as lawyers joke, for about 10 minutes compared to Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, which is now abolished. But those states, it was kind of a cultural institution. And Kansas, on the other hand, it's just not baked in there. Now, I also want to highlight 1935 to 1972, we see about 15 more executions in this state. Okay, so we have a history as a state where approximately, that we know of, 24 people have been put to death. But, as I'm going to highlight in a second, none in this modern era so far. And that's a big feature and a big reason why the death penalty in our state, from a policy standpoint, is toothless and not working. So let's talk about the present here. So I want to give you guys a snapshot of where Kansas is with its capital punishment in the modern era as we sit here today. Okay? There have been, since 1994, 15 death sentences in our state. Okay? We currently have 9 people on our death row. All right? Some of those sentences were reversed by higher courts. Some of those men died of natural causes on death row because, as many of us know, this process is a very long and drawn-out one that doesn't give swiftness or certainty to anybody. So 9 people sit on our death row right now. And as a state, we are very fortunate. There has not been a new death sentence now for over 8 years, since 2016. And this is something the legislative folks are talking about, and you'll all get in a few minutes. But I bring that up and highlight that because that is one of the special ingredients to states that are ready to get rid of the death penalty. All right? states that are ready to move beyond this is going roughly a decade without a new death sentence coming down. And so, let me put this in context a little bit nationally for you. In 2023, there were only 5 states in this whole country that conducted an actual execution. Okay? Only 7 in 2023 imposed any new death sentences, and that was the lowest in 20 years. Okay? As kind of we look at the national landscape, we say there are about 6 active death penalty states. Those are Texas, Oklahoma, our friends to the west in Missouri, Florida, Alabama, to a lesser extent Georgia, and we see signs that South Carolina and Louisiana are kind of trying to move into that zone. We've had nationally, actually, little bit of a backlash. Some of the death penalty states have expanded their use of the death penalty. Louisiana has made child rape, as has Florida, eligible for the death penalty. Kentucky has expanded the list, or the types of murder that can be death eligible in that state. But I bring that all up to say and contrast where we are. Okay, what a lot of the folks in the national abolition movement call Kansas is a low-use state. Okay, we're not quite de facto abolition, but we're close. And I say that because, like I referenced earlier, the death penalty is not baked into our culture. It has not been a part of who we are as Kansans. It has not been here since our founding. It is not something that our juries and judges are doing reflexively. And that's a really important thing to understand when we're talking about how to get rid of this. We're not talking about getting rid of a state institution. And then, right now, across this entire state, we are in a very low and good place. There are only 3 active death penalty cases where the prosecutor has affirmatively said, yes, we are charging capital murder, yes, we are seeking the death penalty. Okay? And that is very serious, and those 3 people, we love and care about, and we are going to do everything we can to save their lives. But to put this in context, again, the state is, in this very short 30 years, already beginning to use this less and less and less. And then, no executions in the modern era at all. Okay, the last execution was in 1965 in Kansas, and so none of the people sentenced to die under the 1994 law in this modern era have ever even gotten close. And let's talk about that real quick. So, do not read every word on this chart, okay? But this is the really rough sketch of the path that a death penalty case would take. All right, I work right up here at the trial level in this, the Johnson County District Court, Wyandotte County District Court, whatever district court that is. And so if there must be a death penalty trial, we have one. And then a death sentence gets appealed up this first chain under number 1. Okay, it can go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then that's roughly a decade or more. Then we get to this chain. It's called post-conviction, and that's in our state courts. You hear the fancy lawyer word habeas sometimes. From there, we repeat a lot of that process in the federal court system. And then if this is all still exhausted and the individual is still under a sentence of death, we then are talking about things like petitioning the governor for clemency, okay? Challenging anything to stave off that execution that may be pending. All right? Many people do not know this. If you listen to the Attorney General talk, you sure wouldn't. Okay? But we are nowhere close. Nowhere close. Okay? You are here. This is where the furthest cases for death-sentenced men in Kansas have gotten. Okay? And not all time is created equal here. All right? There is, with a straight face, we have to say that the federal post-conviction has gotten smaller and shrunk. The clemency thing is not necessarily guaranteed to take years on end. But, last year, Chris Kobach was talking about how we are getting close to executions, and this is something Kansas needs to think about, and that was how he decided to transition into, well, let's gas some people. And my heart broke for those poor victim families that he brought to those legislative hearings and trotted out there, because purposefully or not, he was misleading them to how close this is. The smallest amount of time I've heard, a lawyer who knows what they're talking about say here, is at least several years, okay, and very likely still on the order of closer to a decade. All right. If the Department of Corrections, the prison system in Kansas right now, if you said, well, what's the procedure and protocol to actually conduct an execution? They don't have one. They have not even begun to draw those things up. They have very loose outlines and guidelines. And so this state has just not seriously considered getting to the end of the line. It is on the books. We are sentencing people to it, infrequently, but we are. But it's not actually there in effect, and it may never be. All right, so the question then is, how does somebody get the death penalty in Kansas? How can somebody be sentenced to death? And I'm just going to give you, again, some stuff here on this screen. Don't read every word. But the first stage is that person has to get convicted of something called capital murder. All right, we have second-degree murder, we have first-degree murder, and we have capital murder. And some examples, every kind of capital murder means the intentional, premeditated killing of another person. All right, you thought about it, you meant to do it, and you did it. In some examples, it has to be a special circumstance. So one of the more common ones is a multiple homicide killing, so killed 2 or more people in the same episode. Still, at that stage, not yet actually eligible for the death penalty. All right, the prosecutor has to go a step further with that jury, and they have to prove something called an aggravator or an aggravating circumstance. And so some of these, there's 8 of them, I didn't list it all, but it was the crime heinous, atrocious, and cruel, or I should say especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, because all murders are heinous. Did the person do it to avoid arrest or prosecution? Were they fleeing from justice? Sorry, I had the rape murder copy paste again, that's my fault. But some of these other ones, putting multiple people in danger of great bodily harm or death, those kind of things. And so only if the prosecutor gets here, if the government gets here, is somebody even eligible to be sentenced. And so then the way it works is these juries who are deciding life and death start thinking about this fancy lawyer word called mitigation. All right, and what mitigation is it's any reason that any person can find to give mercy. Okay, and it can be a deeply personal thing to you. It can be what us lawyers sit up there and talk about, with mental health and trauma and all of these, big ticket things. Or, we hear the most moving things sometimes where jurors tell lawyers, after a trial, yeah, I heard what you guys said, but when I saw that man smile at his mother while she was testifying, I saw a real human being, and that's why I gave the weight of life to that, because I knew I couldn't kill that person in that moment. So mitigation can be anything. It is so expansive. Every time I think I know what mitigation is, I realize there's so much more I still don't know. Okay? After the jury hears this part of the trial, the mitigation, they get to this thing we call the weighing question in our business. And kind of keeping it short here, the government has to prove, and this gets confusing, that the mitigation does not outweigh those aggravating circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. All right? And the juries are told this is not like a mathematical scale. They can assign any weight they want to anything. It's kind of supposed to just guide them. But only if the government proves this to all 12 of those jurors will there be an actual verdict for a death sentence. Okay? So how does this really work? All right, so the way this works in a trial is we have 2 parts of a death penalty trial, and Herman talked about this a little, and I think a lot of people know this, but in case you don't, we'll call this, the first phase, the guilt-innocence phase, culpability phase, I've called it up here, and that's the regular trial that we all hear and see on TV, or, a regular criminal case would go through, and that's The jury is fact-finding. Okay, was his DNA on the gun? Was the witness telling the truth? Did the prosecutor coerce that witness with some terrible thing? All right, and in this phase, the jury has to be unanimous, all right? And we all know, that means 12 people all having to agree. But what they're trying to do is this collective decision. So then, what the law says is only if there's a capital murder conviction, and then kind of in between here, only if there's an aggravating circumstance proven, do we really get into the teeth of this sentencing phase. It's the same jury, but kind of a whole new trial with a whole new focus about whether that person should live or die. And this is very different. Okay, instead of being fact finders, instead of deciding was the light green, was it red, was that the witness in that car or somebody else, all these people now are listening to this aggravation and this mitigation, and they're making a reasoned moral judgment about what the appropriate penalty is. Is it life without the possibility of parole? That's the only other option in Kansas for a capital murder conviction. Or is it the death penalty? Okay, and what's also unique here is that the jury goes from one big collective decision maker to 12 individual deciders. And each and every one of them has to make their own personal moral decision, and they are allowed to agree to disagree. In fact, in our verdict forms in Kansas, we very rarely have a place where it says we unanimously agree to life. Okay, the options are we unanimously all agree that the mitigation doesn't outweigh the aggravation beyond a reasonable doubt and the sentence is death, or we, the jury, can't come to a unanimous opinion about whether that's true. And that's it. One vote for life in Kansas is life. Okay? So I say all this, and people are like, well, yeah, that actually sounds like there's a lot of layers of protection, and it sounds like there's a lot of places that a jury or a judge could have an off-ramp, and a lot of places where good lawyering makes a difference, human sense of mercy and dignity would make a difference. So what's the catch? Why is this a problem? Okay? Everything. All right? Everything is the problem. And so I'm going to spend the rest of this time, and I think I'm going to about 3:15. Thank you. Going to about 3:15. So we get about, I'll try to go about 20 minutes and get some questions for the last 5. But I'm going to spend this next 20 minutes talking just at a very broad overview level from kind of the legal courtroom perspective, why all this falls apart. So this very first slide, I call this the fundamental task. And a lot of these next ones have like cool charts and graphs and like really smart people quotes. All right, on this one, I got a picture of a rock and I got a picture of some string, okay? And this was something that, again, a very, very smart person brought to my attention during a court hearing about a week ago. So your friend and mine, the late Justice Antonin Scalia. Not talking about the death penalty, but he was talking about some other legal issue, but I think this really applies to what we're asking jurors to do. We are asking them to take these awful, horrific crimes that just cause trauma by having to know about them and listen to them and see those pictures like Herman talked about. And then we're also presenting them with this exhaustive life information about this damaged person that maybe did commit that heinous act, but is still deserving of life and mercy, and their life can have meaning for themselves and others. And so when you compare those things, how do you do it? And what Justice Scalia said, again, an unrelated thing, was it's like trying to measure if a rock is heavier than a string is long. And so we are asking people to make these reasoned moral judgments. And, I'll actually say, they try. You know, the ones that hopefully we're doing our job, we do jury selection right, they are trying, but this is an impossible thing to ask of a human being. All right, so the fundamental, no matter what we do with the death penalty law to tweak it and all those things, it's always going to still be this. And it is just such an unfair place to put 12 people in the community. And it's impossible. Okay. So I want to talk about another legal problem that's kind of come in a lot of focus here, and that's the jury pool. And there were some questions about this when Herman was talking. But what I'll explain capital jury selection for a second, because a lot of people don't know this. Okay, you cannot serve on a death penalty jury if, when you have a guilty capital murderer, you will always 100% of the time vote for the death penalty. Okay, so the automatic killers, they have to go, because they have to be able to listen to that mitigation. They have to be willing and able to learn about that person and consider both life and death. But here is the catch, okay? If you are somebody like many of us in this room who would never give the death penalty, you cannot meaningfully consider that as opposed to life without parole, you too are barred from serving. So, you know, poor Sister Therese, any member of the institutional Catholic Church is walking up there, they are just per se barred essentially. And a lot of people don't know that, but what happens here is, Herman talked about a jury of peers, we are skewing and rigging the game right from the beginning. And it's not just about the death penalty. First of all, really awesome expert that we work with named Mona Lynch. This is a brief excerpt from a Sedgwick County report she did, and there's very likely to be a Wyandotte one coming soon. What we have found is that because Black and brown individuals have such radically different views on the death penalty because of the horrors inflicted on their community with this, that what this does is, you know, it's hard enough for Black and brown people to serve on juries in our country. This is another siphon in death penalty cases where they don't get to make it on, okay? And what death qualification also does for poor Sister Therese and so many others, all right, is these religious issues, people whose religious faith, their reasoned moral judgment, right, where else would it spring from, keeps them literally from being on there. And, you know, we in our unit have talked about this violating so many individual laws and rights just for people of faith. You know, we talk about race discrimination, we talk about unfairness to the person. This is unfairness to a lot of our people in our community who are genuine and sincere in their religious beliefs, and that's a problem. Okay.
So I have a question.
Sure.
What if you were someone like me, say I'm not posted, but I have a family member that was murdered, would they consider me?
It depends. I think the nuns who come up there are going to be shown the door very quickly, unfortunately. You know, in a realistic scenario, everybody in a death penalty jury pool is getting spoken to, probably individually, not big rooms like this, okay, one-on-one. And those people are being asked about their personal experiences, where they're coming from in life. And the issue isn't whether I've had a family member that's been murdered or whether, you know, I was the victim of violent crime. What it is because of that, is my mind irrevocably made up? The law is, can you still give meaningful consideration? Now, this begs a question that some of our troublemakers, and I want to stress, good trouble, in the room might say for capital jury service is, what if I am called in there? And either as a person of faith or a person who knows the issues, how do I answer these questions? Okay? Now, I could get in a lot of trouble for telling you certain things here, so I'm going to put all this off on a woman some of you may have heard of named Sister Helen Prejean. Okay, she told me this when I was an undergraduate in the mid-2000s, and this is what I tell everybody. Sister Helen said the following. Sister Helen said, you get up there and you tell them you will listen to the evidence, you will give meaningful, you will consider the death penalty. You will find out, you know, you can take that time and figure out, is this a case where maybe I was wrong. And maybe there is somebody out there. And then you know what you go back there and do? You go back there and you say no. Okay? So if Sister Helen tells us it's okay, I'm telling you it's okay.
Well, that was my thought. I was just lying.
We don't lie. We say we're going to consider it, right? And again, it is all about truthfulness, right? We rely on people being truthful in this process, and of course, we want all of you to be truthful. But the big thing for us is we want everyone to feel safe and non-judgmental. So it's a little counterintuitive. But when people get up there and they're like, yeah, eye for an eye, everybody has to go who does this, we say, thank you for sharing. We really appreciate that. Tell me more, okay? Because we need to show them the door. So the jury pool, kind of first big bucket of problems. Now another one is decline of the death penalty in our country. And I say this is a problem because when the Supreme Court got rid of it for those 4 years, they used this phrase that's a little kind of wacky, but it sticks with you. They said the death penalty is so wanton and freakish that it's kind of cruel the way that a lightning bolt is cruel. Like, who does it hit? Who does it kill? There's no rhyme or reason to that. All right? And so I say that this decline brings these issues up because, our country at one point was using this a lot, and now it's gone downhill. It's gone downhill in our state. So it's now just this really perverse lottery. So in America, what we've had is public opinion, first of all, has gone from the 1990s, where we have basically 4/5 of this country saying, yep, kill them all, now down to barely half. And this changes actually real quickly to less than half, depending on how you ask the question. When you say, are you in favor of the death penalty or not, you still get about half. But when you say, would you be in favor of the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole? Just that little bit of truth there, suddenly even more people are saying, no, we don't need that. So public opinion has changed a lot. And so consequently, we see death sentences. In 1996, there were 316 new ones. We are down in the teens and 20s now, and this is nationwide. Okay, it has slowed to a crawl. Prosecutors are seeking it less, juries are giving it less. This does not have anything to do with reduced crime rates or anything like that, and we'll talk about that more. And then execution, same thing. We peak in the late 1990s, okay, nearly 100 at that point, and now by the year 2024, we've had only 21 this calendar year so far. So we see the same kind of pattern there. So, I bring this up again as a legal problem to say, we are increasingly having these men that face this penalty, be in this ever dwindling number. And you can imagine there are so many more cases in Kansas and around this country that legally could qualify for the death penalty. But, the individual prosecutor, what they had for breakfast that morning, it's this arbitrariness that makes all this difference. Okay? So another arbitrary thing is race and gender. And what has become very evident in Kansas is that, and especially in Kansas, but elsewhere too, is that, the race of the person on trial matters, and there's some statistical relationship there with black and brown people, again, being more likely to get death. But where it really kicks up is the race of the victim. Okay, and so this is this really smart guy named Frank Baumgartner, who just testified in a hearing a couple weeks ago. And this was his words in his report: a system used extremely rarely. It appears to be statistically disconnected from patterns of homicides, but potentially has much to do with race and gender, is far from the even-handed, rational, consistent imposition of death sentences under law. Okay? And what Professor Baumgartner did is basically every Kansas homicide since 1994, and looking at the race and gender of the victim and looking at which one of those actually ended up all the way with a death sentence. And you can see from this line way out here, And these red pie wedges here, if you kill a white woman in the state of Kansas, you are much statistically more likely to be sentenced to die. And we see what this looks like for killers of people of color. And it should make us wonder, which lives matter and which ones don't in this country. But this is, again, the kind of arbitrariness. Race and gender should have nothing to do with this, but legally we know this is where the lightning bolts are coming. Okay, so beyond race and gender, geography. Okay, this is a map, I think it's current through about 2022. We say, Texas is a death penalty state. Oklahoma is a death penalty state. Florida is a death penalty state. Okay, that's really an oversimplification. The death penalty is a creature of individual counties in those states. And the reason this is so arbitrary, and again, the lightning coming, is we have prosecutors that are specific to these counties. There is such thing as an attorney general that's for the whole state, but the vast majority of states, the people prosecuting death penalty cases are the local district attorneys. And so they are the gatekeepers. And so what you see is so much of this country has had little to no death sentences. I think, this is from an article called The 2% Death Penalty, because I think it's about 2% of counties in America have actually turned out a death sentence in the modern era. It's extraordinarily low. And so the death penalty really is a creature of Harris and Tarrant County in Texas. It's really a creature of Miami-Dade County in Florida, like Herman was talking about. Maricopa County in Arizona, it's not on this map, but my home county, Mobile County, Alabama, is a hot spot. There was disproportionate death sentencing compared to its share of state population. Okay, so it's about these individual prosecutors and their judgments. And this is a county, a thing with the most since 2013. We actually see some California counties on here, but we see these same ones coming up over and over, and it's because these elected prosecutors bend one way versus their neighbor next door who bends another way. And how is that fair? How is that coin flip fair on a murder was on one side of a county line and not the other? And so you face the death penalty just because of that arbitrary place and time. Deterrence. So, one of the justifications for death that I'm sure you've all heard is, it must stop people from committing these kind of crimes. And I think intuitively we know that's a little ridiculous that people stop and think in these situations. But in Kansas, this was studied again with all the homicides and all the homicide rates. And a very awesome guy, Jeff Fagan, in conclusion, no credible evidence that the death penalty has a deterrent effect on homicide rates in Kansas. And here's the chart. We've got the orange-brown there, that's death sentences. Murder statewide, I'm not great with statistics and math. If I was, maybe I'd be a doctor. I don't know. That's what law school is for, is people who are bad at math. And yeah, so you can see these lines don't make sense or match with each other, right? Even if we're bad at math, it just, homicides do one thing, death sentences do another. There's no statistical control that the death penalty has on the amount of murders in our state. Actual execution stuff is a big problem, and this is kind of a lot of the news headlines we have seen over the last few years, okay? We've seen all these botches of lethal injections, and as many of you know, this is because these states are having to turn to increasingly sketchy providers to get these drugs, because most pharmaceutical providers do not want their names on this. Capital lawyers have gotten blamed by a couple of justices of the Supreme Court I won't mention. It's not us. These are just regular people at their businesses who are saying, I don't want our products, which are supposed to help people, used as poison to kill some people. All right. We know, again, that my home state has executed now 2 people with nitrogen gas. Okay. And then what we also see with actual executions, besides just the cruelty of it, is, the death penalty is supposed to be this retributive, punishing of swift and certain thing. And we see that we're, at least a couple of decades on average between the death sentence and the actual imposition, if there ever will be one. In Kansas, we are closing in on, I believe, 30 years or so since the first death sentence in the state in the modern era. And that individual has not even begun so much of that other process I showed you on that slide. So this delay is, it defeats the purpose of it. And think for a second what this does to those poor victim families who are promised this vengeance and this ultimate penalty by these prosecutors, and then for decades they have to see the appeals in the newspaper, they have to keep coming back to court. That's, our hearts should break for them. Okay? Obviously innocence, okay? That was what our first presentation was on, all right? We hit the grim milestone recently, 200 exonerations from death row in this country. Okay, I want to say the names of these people because Kansas has never had a death row exoneration, but has had 3 people whose crimes could have been charged capitally and could have been sentenced to death. Olin Pete Coons, Lamont McIntyre, who has a very similar story in some ways to Herman, and Floyd Bledsoe. Okay, all of those people's lives could have been extinguished or could be awaiting that in just with a few small extra flaps of the butterfly wing. Last thing, I have this opinion, crazily enough with my job, that innocents or not, we shouldn't kill guilty people either. And, the death penalty is often, I think Herman used this phrase, it's supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst. And, I want to be clear that as capital lawyers, we see horrific crimes where there often may not be a very substantial question of who did that or was this actually a crime or not. And these are very bad crimes. But in my travels, what I have never met is a person who is the worst of the worst. And this is kind of the ultimate arrogance of the death penalty, is not just we think we know who did it, but we think we know who deserves it. And so, a phrase I like is that in the end, all we are stories. So let me tell you a few stories about some of the people I've come across in this walk of mine. There was a client who, when his mother found out she was pregnant, drank every day to try and end that pregnancy, could not go afford a legal abortion, would punch herself in the stomach and throw herself down the stairs before that child was even born. That's how his life began. I had another client, his first memory was his father shooting and killing his mother in front of him. As a toddler, that was the first thing that was imprinted. A client who lived in a rural Black community in the South. He and his family did not get electricity and plumbing and had to use the bathroom in an outhouse until the 1980s. That is the kind of poverty that he lived under. I had a client who, him and his brothers and sisters had to carry knives around their home when they were as young as 6, 7 years old to protect themselves from getting raped by their stepdad. Client who would watch his mom and dad fight, and they'd throw each other around, and all these light bulbs would get broken, and the siblings would have to take a potato so that they didn't get cut by the broken glass to unscrew the broken bulb. That was kind of their morning ritual after the domestic violence at night. A client who, as of the 1990s, wasn't allowed to play at the Little League baseball fields because he was Black. Okay, a client who every day for 2 years was stopped by a cop and thrown against the hood of a cop car in his community, doing nothing wrong. Okay, a client who was 17 when he committed his first crime, and this sent him down a really difficult path. But instead of going to juvenile court like you do when you're not 18, nobody actually did the math. The attorneys, the prosecutor, the judge, everybody was just like, oh, you must be 18, that's fine. We have people who are so cognitively disabled that their moms would talk about, I could send him to the store with a shopping list, and he couldn't even, tried so hard but couldn't get the right items. He couldn't come back with the correct change. Clients who are so mentally ill, that they believe that their spouses, their children are, genetic abominations and not people because of the depths of the severe mental illness. And so, I say don't kill the guilty either, and it's because we should not kill sick people and traumatized people. We are better than that. So many people talk about the death penalty as power. And I just want to impress on you, we can show power through mercy. When you meet violence with love, and when you meet death with life and being better, that is power. This is a system that is irrevocably broken in our state and everywhere else. And we as people become irrevocably broken when we are engaging in this because of all these problems. So, folks, I hope this has been a good overview for you. If we have time for maybe one quick or two quick questions, happy to get those. Yes, sir.
Couple of things. Herman's, one of his comments was, we have one of the best criminal justice systems in the world. And now we talked about how system in Kansas and other places are irretrievably broken. How do you and he appear to have opposite views on that?
No, and I'm not sure I know the perfect answer, but real quick, he works on an international level that I don't. And I can only scarcely imagine some of the horrors we see with the death penalty in other countries. And also I'll say, I don't know if this is what Herman meant, but I am not necessarily saying that every part of our system is bad. And in theory, our system can be the best, right? We have the failings of people in this country and these actors that fail to live up to that. But I agree with Herman to the extent that we have so many good ideas and there's so many good original efforts at fairness, but as human beings, we've just fallen short.
And also, you mentioned that studies in Kansas show that deterrence does not have an effect.
Yeah.
But then Kansas is one of the ones that hasn't executed anybody. Have there been studies to look at deterrence in states like Missouri and Oklahoma and some of those states that are executing people?
Yeah, several hundred deterrence studies across the country, executions and death sentences both as the statistical correlator. I believe literally one from the 1970s found any statistical relationship. The other 499 or whatever it is have not.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
If the family of a victim, if they do not want the murderer to have the death penalty, does their opinion influence the sentence?
Goodness gracious, that's a lot to unpack. What I'll say is that the victim's family, by law, can communicate that to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor has to take and listen to that, but the prosecutor ultimately decides. Jurors in Kansas are told they're not supposed to consider the wishes of the victim unless there's evidence of that, and very rarely is there evidence of that. But we know it's on their minds a lot. So, there's often an assumption that the victim's family is pounding the table for death. But I think, I've worked so many cases where it's never necessarily that and everything in between. Celeste, were you trying to get my attention for time?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't want to cut everybody off. Guys, we've got about 5 minutes. I think everybody's just going to switch rooms is how it's going. Please go have a great time with Donna and Ron and learn how you can get involved in this. And again, thank you for being here, and I'm happy to chat in the interim.